Robbie Lawler was out of control.
This is Double Cross, the murder of Robbie Lawler.
It was going to be an all-out war with him in the middle of it.
Crime World special investigation podcast based on my new book, Web of Betrayal, wherever you get your podcasts.
That's a pity.
Yeah.
So, okay, just explain to anybody. Is there anybody out there listening? I'm kind of, do you know what? I'm tired and I'm slightly giddy. But anyway, yeah, here on the screen. There it is. It's on the fourth screen. It's this really dreamy picture of a mountaintop with clouds. And it just came on the screen there a minute ago, really massive and very zen-y, wasn't it?
It was.
There it is. Thank you, NASA.
Really puts us in much better form.
It's like we've taken edibles or something here.
I don't know what that would be like, but
it's beautiful. I don't know where that's come from. It's new. It's all new.
Yeah.
How are you sort of feeling? Are you tired?
I'm a bit tired, yeah.
You look kind of like you're
I look well, I would say. What you were going to say there, was it?
I was, of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
Particularly well today.
Yeah, particularly well. And you were looking at yourself on the screen until the green mountain came up.
Yeah.
You're feeling ready for
ready for what?
Ready for anything. Ready for what we're going to talk about.
Yes, I am, of course.
Good.
So go on, segue into Peadar Keating.
I'm going to, because I'm just actually, was just about to say to you, I have just received, just literally live dropping here, is the NCA press release, the National Crime Agency press release, on the fact that Kinahan OCG member's son and accomplice, that's Jack Kavanagh and Peadar Keating, have been sentenced for firearms concealment plot even. Now, we did a podcast early last week, or in the middle of last week. We were talking to Eamon Dillon about the court case. But there was something interesting happened in the middle of this case that, you know, would have been something that would pass you by unless you were totally and utterly intricately interested in these people and all the rest of it. And it was the fact that over the course of the case, Peadar Keating communicated to the court in London, the Old Bailey, that he had completely severed ties with Bomber Kavanagh's operation, essentially, the organised crime group involved in this plot. Now, we have referred to it, sort of swung between the Byrne organised crime group and the Kavanagh organised crime group. And it was previously Kavanagh and his buddy James Mulvey were sort of involved. Kavanagh has had a huge amount of different characters central to him and his operations over the decades.
Absolutely.
They get blown, you know, they get picked up by the NCA, jailed, and he seems to move on to the next grouping. I mean, we can clearly identify 3 different groupings.
Yeah, I mean,
thus far.
Certainly some of them have had a hard run. People like Hatchet Kavanagh, who was Thomas Bomber Kavanagh's first cousin, who was probably his number one sidekick, I suppose, for many, many years. Hatchet Kavanagh was from Drimnagh as well, but had a base of operations in Tala. He had eventually moved out to Spain, where he had certainly moved in the same circles as the Kinahans, but he'd really been Bomber's man in Spain while Bomber lived in Tamworth. Now, we know Hatchet Kavanagh was shot dead, and also Paul Kavanagh, Hatchet Kavanagh's brother, also obviously automatically a cousin of Bomber Kavanagh too. Yeah. And we believe that was as a result of Bomber Kavanagh, at least, if not directly planning it, certainly giving it the okay or making it happen.
Well, that actual murder, which I think it occurred in the days nearly after the shooting of Jamie Moore in Daniel Kinahan's property. Yeah. And I think it was around the time that Daniel Kinahan had gone to a solicitor and was looking for protection from the police. Now, what we now know is, and in particular because of our recent interview with Jerry Hutch, that shooting of Jamie Moore at Daniel Kinahan's property was ultimately blamed on Gary Hutch, and I think he said possibly a brother.
Yeah.
So that fallout had occurred, and it was confusing really what was happening because Gary Hutch had gone on the run. I think he went up to Amsterdam at the time, and there was some suggestion that he'd been picked up, kidnapped, sort of jumped out of a car. It was all very movie style. But in the meantime, while this was all happening, there was a clear schism occurring within the Kinahan organised crime group, who were hugely powerful, violent and dangerous at the time. All of a sudden, Hatchet Kavanagh is shot dead in Harmon's bar in Marbella. And of course, as is often the case, it was blamed on the Russians, because everything gets blamed on the goddamn Russians.
Yeah.
And in actual fact, what has emerged since is that was very complicated, plot that was orchestrated by Daniel Kinahan. And it was like as if I think he saw an opportunity when there was other things occurring. I have never got to the bottom of why he made a suggestion to Bomber Kavanagh that Hatchet Kavanagh should be. Well, I know the reason he told Bomber Kavanagh, but what his personal grievance against Hatchet Kavanagh was, I've kind of come to the conclusion it was a personal dislike, or he'd obviously in some way insulted Daniel Kinahan or whatever. But what occurred was Kinahan went to Bomber Kavanagh, and he told him that Hatchet, who we've often referred to as Bomber's cousin, I'm not 100% sure they are cousins, even though I think, obviously they have the same second name. But Daniel Kinahan told Bomber Kavanagh that Hatchet was plotting to kidnap one of his children.
Yeah.
And Kavanagh believed it.
Yeah.
And sort of sanctioned that he could be killed. Now, step back from that a little bit, and how much sense does that make? How could Bomber Kavanagh consider that his business partner was going to come and kidnap one of his children? Kidnap is such a high-risk crime. Hatchet Kavanagh would never need to physically kidnap a child. He was going to look for €1 million ransom or something. But one way or another, Kinahan was convincing enough, Kavanagh believed it, and the murder went ahead.
And certainly carried out by people really, really close to Daniel Kinahan.
Really close to Daniel Kinahan. And the video of that murder, I think, was the CCTV was often played, is probably still somewhere on the internet.
Yeah. And then obviously Paul Kavanagh was shot dead in March 2015 in Drumcondra, another really high-profile killing. So that was two of Bomber Kavanagh's closest associates.
Now, it was just sort of in the aftermath of all this that Mulvey, James Mulvey, his previous business partner and a cousin, we think,
yes, I
from
think
Birmingham.
He was described as a cousin now. Could be second cousins and all that sort of stuff.
He'd been on the run, Mulvey, since 2012, but he was ultimately picked up in Kaunas in 2017. But that sort of called him a cell, I suppose, structure of his operation based around Mulvey had been busted previously by the National Crime Agency.
Yeah.
And Bomber had slipped the net.
Yeah, he had, like James Mulvey had been, I suppose, a wholesaler of drugs for the Bomber Kavanagh operation through England, in particular around Birmingham, but in other cities as well. He'd been a very senior figure. But you did hear after he was convicted, the NCA released all this surveillance, phone calls and even videos. And you can hear even at that point, James Mulvey describe in the terror he had, I suppose, of Bomber Kavanagh. I think he referred to as glasses.
Yes.
As Bomber Kavanagh certainly wears glasses, but was known to have worn glasses. Like he was in fear of Bomber Kavanagh. And obviously, as he was convicted, James Mulvey was described as one of the major drug dealers operating in the UK, full stop. So you can see how Bomber Kavanagh, even guys at that level, lived in fear of him. I mean, there's no doubt about that. And
I mean, that case against Mulvey, which was ultimately heard in 2018 after he was picked up, he got 32 years jail for his role in that conspiracy to import cocaine. And it was on an industrial scale, obviously. There was a figure of, say, at the time, 300 million or something worth of cocaine. But what they had done was they had discovered how they were doing it, how the cocaine was moving, and they had sort of estimated how many times they had actually got it in.
Yeah.
And it was similar. It was the activities of a haulage firm boss that became of interest to authorities after a tip-off from a Belgian warehouse worker.
Yeah.
And the investigation found that Mulvey had a legitimate firm and it was being used to transport cocaine and cannabis in these metal rollers, which were stored then in a Worcestershire village called Inkborough. Not
dissimilar operation to what Bomber Kavanagh ultimately will
exactly. With two Irishmen, Daniel Canning and Gary Vickery.
Gary Vickery.
With two Irishmen, Gary Vickery and Daniel Canning. And ultimately, it involved basically this cocaine being brought into England and the Republic in these sort of big industrial containers. And these were all, the Mulvey arrest and conviction was centred on activities between 2006 and 2007. The later operation, which Kavanagh obviously gets back up and running, into the UK with a similar thing. He's bringing these big machines in.
Yeah, and I think that the idea of the machines is that the cocaine can be stored in the middle of them, but they aren't vulnerable to the X-rays. Obviously, one of the ways that drug smuggling is uncovered is that large items coming in are X-rayed and they can see the drugs stored within. But on both of these occasions, all these devices are not, they're not ideal for finding drugs in that way.
And in the case where Kavanagh ultimately got the hefty sentence, along with Vickery and Canning, they were moving the drugs in them, and they were using the same piece of machinery to move the cash back out to Europe. It was all centred around Belgium and travelling across Europe. So the Mulvey operation went, and there was others, by the way, jailed as well in that. There
was. And I mean, obviously, one of the interesting bits about James Mulvey is that when we did hear the cab case against Sean McGovern, James Mulvey's name came up again.
That's right.
James Mulvey's a bank account he had in the Caribbean was used to purchase Sean McGovern's house in Dublin, again sort of showing the connections between all of those organisations. And actually, James Mulvey, when he was convicted, he was described as a first cousin of Hatchet Kavanagh.
Right.
So all of those links are there.
So moving on forward with Bomber, he is also connected very heavily with Lee Cullen, who's a car dealer from Dublin, who was a friend's and would have knocked around the Mansfield sort of estate where, of course, Daniel Kinahan and Kavanagh and the Byrne brothers and all were always sort of in and out, and were actually laundering money through the Mansfield network. But so Lee Cullen, and along with Graham the Whig Whelan, who's now in a relationship, of course, with Conor McGregor's sister, and who formed part of that original Crumlin mob, they were all out there in Birmingham together. As well. And Lee Cullen is now in jail on a separate firearms plot.
Yeah, he's serving a huge sentence, again, a 21-year sentence for his role in the importation of guns and ammunition. But Lee Cullen was an interesting character, I suppose. He was knocking around with the Mansfields. He was running a car business, a legitimate car business, that he had a relatively high public profile. He was then investigated by the Criminal Assets Bureau, who obviously suspected other activities. But from what we do know, what happened with Lee Cullen was he ultimately owed Bomber Kavanagh a huge amount of money. He ended up in debt, something in the region of millions. Pick your own figure, I suppose. And he had, at this point, his businesses weren't there. And he basically had suffered a number of really, really violent beatings because he was unable to pay this debt. Now, effectively, if you owe a couple of million, how are you going to pay it? I mean, it's almost, it's an unimaginable amount of money. So he ultimately ended up in Birmingham, and it was described to us previously that he was something like a sort of almost like a slave to Bomber Kavanagh in, trying to work off this unworkable amount of money. And he was required to do whatever he was told. But ultimately he came a cropper and was caught in this firearms plot and is serving a lengthy sentence. Another person who didn't profit from his association.
No. So next you sort of move on, I suppose, to that Regency Hotel. I think his brother-in-law, David Byrne, is murdered. He comes together with Daniel Kinahan to form this sort of alliance of violence to hit back. And he takes on, Bomber Kavanagh, a lot of the killing, and the lesson teaching here in Ireland to anybody who should challenge the ferocity of the groupings. But in the sort of fallout from all that, Kavanagh's gang here are targeted in a number of ways. the Byrne organised crime group, which was like the Dublin branch. And again, it's like the Byrne Kavanagh organised crime group for ease of mention. They're very heavily targeted in the aftermath of the Regency by the Criminal Assets Bureau and by others. They're kind of run out of Dublin, really. Liam Byrne moves to Birmingham. But left behind is what is this unknown cell structure that Kavanagh has, headed up, we'll say, by Declan Brady, aka Mr. Nobody. And Brady is from Kildare. In 2017, he and others are caught up in this big storage facility where a huge arsenal of weapons has arrived from the UK. They are described as primed and ready for use in the Kinahan Hutch feud. There was 9 revolvers, 4 semi-automatic pistols, a submachine gun, assault rifle, 1,300 rounds of ammunition, and they were all found in the Green Oak Business Park. So Brady is jailed for 10 years in relation to that, and others again from that cell structure before the courts, and they're jailed.
Yeah, for example, Jonathan Harding, who had a long-term association with Liam Byrne, previously being convicted of a major heroin haul, like very trusted, but a lesser sort of cog in the machine run by Declan Brady, known as Mr. Nobody.
And like, I suppose, as the Garda operation against both the Kinahan and Hutch factions, but particularly concentrated on Kavanagh's grouping, and it's concentrated really on trying to stop the murders initially before the dismantling of the criminal organisations occurred. But so despite that, in the January 2017, that big huge haul and the arrest of loads of his associates and cell structure members, he forges onwards again in this desire, along with Kinahan, to take out James Mago Gately, a close associate on the Hutch side of things. And Kavanagh sends his top men out to do that. Yeah. Because there's very few left that can be trusted. Peadar Keating is caught up in this plot to kill James Mago Gately that includes the hitman Imre Arakas, who seems to have been employed by Kinahan. This was like the Kinahan Kavanagh organisations come together with this, really, isn't it?
Yeah, and Peadar Keating, I suppose, at that point was one of the more senior figures left living in Ireland and free. Now, Peadar Keating had been involved in organised crime for a long time. Like, we talk about cells and organised crime gangs, but these things are far more fluid, I suppose, than those simple terms. But effectively, Keating was a key figure in a sort of West Dublin crime outfit that was supplied directly by the Byrne organised crime group, but they would have had a large degree of autonomy. They're based in areas sort of Clondalk and parts of Ballyfermot. They would have had a sophisticated sort of independent money laundering operation. They would have had interests in local businesses. They would have used that to wash their money. They would have had, I suppose, they would have received the drugs, but then would have had a bit of freedom in what they did. And what would have happened was Keating would have come to the attention as part of in advance of the Hutch Kinahan feud. If you remember, there was a guy called Dean Johnson, a totally innocent man that was shot dead. He had been mistakenly killed as Keating's gang had attempted to kill a guy called James Nellie Walsh. And what had happened was this sort of separate feud had erupted in that part of Dublin, and Peadar Keating's brother-in-law, Jay Carroll, would have been shot dead as a result of that. Peadar Keating would have been, himself and Jason Carroll would have been very much at the top of that criminal organisation. That was a very violent outbreak of violence, and it was always said that Keating had to sort of get that sanctioned by Bomber Kavanagh and even other people within the Kinahan structure to be allowed to fight back, for example. So by the time we're talking in 2000, by the time the attempt on the life of James Mago Gately is occurring, what has happened is that Keating had been back and forth, I think, to the UK at that stage. He'd even been picked up in relation to a drug seizure in the UK at one stage that was being controlled by the Bomber Kavanagh organisation, though he wasn't charged. And he had become, I suppose, the person in charge of putting all this plot together for James Mago Gately, or certainly one of the senior figures. Ultimately, he was viewed, caught on CCTV, travelling up to the north where Mago Gately had fled as the pressure had come on, and he'd been seen kind of checking it out, basically. That ultimately, that CCTV, I think, would have led to his guilty plea. He was kind of caught on sight and there was very little he could do. But you can see the amount of logistics that went into that planning. There was a number of people obviously convicted of it, including Imre Arakas, who I suppose was brought in to be the gunman.
So, I mean, a lot of people are falling around Bomber, including Peadar Keating, who's now at this point serving a 10-year sentence in jail. Bomber is under the focus of the National Crime Agency, and they are investigating his own drug operation in the UK, which he is eventually charged with this massive amount of drugs. Again, it's like, it's 200 million or something.
Yeah.
And while
it's only a snapshot, actually, which is the...
it's only a snapshot, yeah. But while he's before the courts, he sets up this plot to hand over some weapons into Newry. Hand over some weapons to the police in order to get himself a smaller sentence, a shorter sentence. We've been through that. But here's where he takes another set of people out with him.
Yeah.
You know, he's a destructive kind of a character. And Keating again is kind of finds himself facing jail.
Yeah, because I mean, at this point, he's presumably worried about his own. He's likely to go to prison anyway as part of the investigations that occur in Ireland. And it's described in court that Keating is sort of reluctantly becomes involved. And that it seems that other people have sort of reluctantly become involved. They don't particularly want to be involved in this plot. They probably don't fancy it, given the fact that, it involves dealing with the police in a sort of a deceptive way, and also just solely dealing with the police. However, he seems to be an organizer, and that seems to be his value to Bomber Kavanagh. This is a guy who can handle that sort of bit of the business.
And of course, it's all caught on EncroChat, all of this. And, you can hear his reluctance. He doesn't want to deal with... He doesn't want to take phone calls, first of all, from Kavanagh from prison. So Kavanagh sends his son, Jack, down to Keating's house. And Keating's obviously living in Tamworth at this point, in Birmingham. And we're talking here in 2020.
Yeah.
And at a time when the Encro phones are being hacked by the police. He's reluctant, but I think he ultimately gets involved and does his bidding.
Yeah, I think for the reason, and even Jack Kavanagh is Bomber's own son. It's described in court how he's put under pressure. So obviously all these guys around Bomber Kavanagh, they may think this sounds like a mad idea that has so much potential to go wrong, but there's that fear factor. That seems to be everybody who's involved in Kavanagh. And some of this is not just what we hear in court, but what we hear from outside of court, that he inspires this level of fear, that people are genuinely terrified of the guy.
Well, they do what he says, don't they? I mean, and even behind bars, even from prison, he has the ability to order them around. And you can see how dominant and domineering he is, that he doesn't get Keating on the phone. I think he actually tells the son to tell Keating to ring him in the prison.
Yeah.
And Keating isn't going to do that because he knows it'll be recorded and there's no way he's going to incriminate himself. And then he sends the son round and he's on the phone.
Yeah.
And the son hands Keating the phone and Bomber's there from prison on the phone. He gets it done even though he's behind bars.
Yeah.
And I mean, somebody like Peadar Keating is a very significant figure in organised crime himself. It's hard to imagine him taking orders.
Yeah, but you see, this is the fear factor because, you know that there are some people in this world that if you don't do what they say, they're going to come at you for as long as until they're put in the ground. And that's obviously the the reality for Peadar Keating. Certainly at that point in 2020, Bomber Kavanagh is in prison. He's facing these charges, but he still has enough. Peadar Keating clearly believes that this guy still cannot be said no to, no matter what. However, this week then we get this. We hear in court that he's openly disassociating himself from Bomber, and that is a remarkable development. The fact that not just is he's cutting ties with him, but he's publicly doing so, and that must show beyond all doubt that fear factor has now passed, and that Bomber Kavanagh is
his power is now
gone.
Well, certainly depleted when it comes to Keating. But interestingly, when Keating was initially arrested in prison in relation to this plot, and it was clear he was going to be extradited, he was going up and down to court, he was actually saying in the prison that, I think he was calling Bomber a rat.
Yeah.
Because he had done this deal, or it had emerged he'd done this deal. Now, I initially thought he had sort of been tricked into it. Yeah. Into doing it. But actually, when the EncroChat messages were read out, you could realise, no, he wasn't actually, he knew what was happening. He just did it.
Yeah.
But what I was told was, that he was sort of going around prison saying that, but to kind of publicly state it in court. Yeah. And I'm going to just read you a statement that was sent posted by his solicitor in the aftermath of the court this week. So Kieran Shields from Madden and Finucane, which is a firm in the north in Derry and Belfast, said outside of the court that in respect of the sentence passed, and of course Keating got 4 years, 8 months, the least sentence that Judge Katz said he could actually give him. And this is quoting Shields. Ultimately, the sentencing judge has honoured Judge Katz' case. He considered there was merit in our submissions that our client, Mr. Keating, 1, acted under direction, 2, demonstrated a marked lack of reluctance to initially become involved, 3, that he responded to a general message that there was going to be a quote, cracking of heads if weapons were not quickly acquired to dispose of, and 4, that the conspiracy was to ultimately reduce the length of Thomas Kavanagh's sentence rather than kill anyone. And finally, this is the important bit, 5, that the defendant had for a long time entirely severed his own links with the organised crime gang concerned.
Yeah, which is it's an unusual thing, obviously, for somebody to say. Like we used to have it, of course, with the Republicans who'd publicly disassociate themselves from the IRA or something like that. But for that to be said in such a public way, and in court, his legal team basically said that he was disgusted that Kavanagh had got his son in trouble, his own son, Jack Kavanagh, 24-year-old, who he was directing and what to do. No previous convictions, Eamon told us this week. A guy who had studied accountancy and who the judge sort of said, was on the right track until this happened, and that he was clearly sort of following the orders of his father. And Keating suggested to the court that he found that these were just soft lads, that his own child was, wrapped in cotton wool and wasn't like him. Yeah. And that Kavanagh's child was the same, and yet he had sort of, dirtied his... Yeah, he got him, obviously. It said in court by the judge that Jack Kavanagh was put under pressure and, dragged into this plot, and obviously ended up receiving a 36-month sentence himself. That'll always be honest. Keating is clearly stating there that the buck stops with him. He may have chosen a path in life, but he doesn't want it for his family, which I think is an interesting insight. Yeah. And I think I mentioned to you before, I was in court when Keating was jailed that day it wasn't actually there for him. He just sort of appeared in for sentencing. And it was interesting. He was getting 10 years in prison, which was a long time. And they were detailing what age his own children were. And his wife was there in the court. And there was they were devastated, the two of them as a couple. Yeah. That it's like a sort of a compartmentalization. He's able to compartmentalize what he does and the reasons he does it, but doesn't want it for his family. And he's sort of looking down his nose on Kavanagh because Kavanagh has brought in his 24-year-old son into his world. Look, Peadar Keating, in fairness, was always said to be a family man. it's sometimes said about other people and may not be fully true, but that was always said about him.
I always kind of find it extraordinary when you see adults, I suppose, being involved in crime and then, they're either encouraging or their kids. I mean, even look at the Byrne family. I mean, James Jaws Byrne was a long time involved in organised crime, and both his sons, Liam and David Byrne, were involved in either even heavier organised crime. And there was a sense given from the Criminal Assets Bureau case that both he and, other members of the family were living off that.
Yeah.
And it just seems so unnatural to people get involved in crime for all sorts of reasons. But there is that sort of sense from a lot of people I've spoken to anyway involved in organised crime. They do not want it for their kids.
No, I mean, and obviously the other example is Christy Kinahan and his two sons,
Very
Christy
true.
Jr. and Daniel, who obviously, have all risen together to the top of the international drug dealing. But there certainly is many criminals who go out of their way to ensure that their own children don't follow in their footsteps and don't want it for their kids, and recognise that it's not something that should be encouraged. And I have heard of cases of people whose fathers are high level criminals who not only do they not want it, but they go to almost any length to ensure that the sons do stay on the right road. And if they hear of anybody dealing with them or selling them drugs or getting them involved in drugs, come down really, really heavy. And I did remember getting a call about that. One guy in particular who had absolutely nearly killed somebody who'd got his son involved, mixed up in something. Mm-hmm. So it is. And
like I was over in Tamworth in 2015, and at that point, Kavanagh's kids were teenagers, they were young. And they were all attending some sort of a fancy private school.
Yeah, they were. You could see them in the uniforms.
Yeah,
it was I think a Catholic private school, and he like Keating is right.
And they were also living a life that was completely different to the one that I suppose their father grew up in or with. They were in this very privileged. I mean, Bomber Kavanagh was sort of posing at that point in Birmingham as a legitimate businessman who'd made his money in second-hand cars. And there's no reason to believe that they knew any differently. Although I think, you'd wonder what life the family led with him. When he was ultimately caught by the National Crime Agency, there was an arsenal of weapons found in his bedroom, which were terrifying. I mean, they were a collection of weapons that he had. We know that he willfully pulverized people that worked for him, that were around them. He led with fear. He terrorized them. Is a man like that any different in the home?
Well, if you watch The Sopranos, and I'm aware it's not a documentary, you can see that. I don't know if you remember the famous scene where Meadow asks Tony in the car, I think they're going to visit, she's still in school, but they're going to visit one of these college open days, and says, "Are you in the mafia?" Because of course people can be very different to their families. So they may hear rumours of this and see dodgy people around the house, but as a father they could be, they absolutely may not see that. And
well, I watched Bomber Kavanagh the other day in court, and he was, he was on a link himself from Belmarsh prison, and they had managed to not switch off the audio for a period of time. Now the judge had risen, and he was, I presume it was his lawyer, he was talking to, but he was pretty scary. Like he was, you could hear him giving out ding dong. He moves his hands around a lot. He's a really big, powerful looking man, 57 years of age. He's going to be at least another 10 years in prison. But he's not exactly going to be totally elderly, I suppose, when he gets out. He may be depleted of some of his wealth. But yeah, it's just a different kind of a thing. And his son didn't get involved through anybody else. He is personally bringing his son into that world of organised crime.
Yeah, and I mean, I think
a kid who's educated, a kid who's been given a chance of a different life, who doesn't have to go into that.
I think there is a difference as well of people that, and we've seen this quite regularly in organised crime, both in Ireland and abroad, that if a child who has effectively a middle class privilege upbringing as being the son of a criminal, and they become involved in criminality, they often do it really, really badly. There are other people. I mean, Daniel Kinahan and Christy Jr. probably did have access to wealth at times in their upbringing, but they grew up in the Oliver Bond flats, and that is the world that they came from. They came from their people that they grew up with, came involved in crime.
And their mother, Jane Boylan, I think, did try very hard to keep
100%.
them away.
But they weren't exactly going to private schools and living in mansions. So they have some of their own, and they may have been different than the other kids because of Christy Senior, who spent a lot of time in prison, I suppose, when they were growing up. But you have seen in I remember even famously John Gotti's own sons, and they were. What did they call one of them? There was the Dapper Don, obviously, was John Gotti, but his son, who'd grown up a privileged background, was given some other, the Dumb Don or something like that. And so what I mean is that, sometimes it doesn't work out, and Peadar Keating is right. These kids are growing up in a totally different world, despite the fact that their fathers were embedded into it.
So, and that the end of Bomber Kavanagh? And obviously it's the end of any relationship between Peadar Keating and Bomber Kavanagh. And Peadar Keating, of course, will be returning to Portlaoise Prison, where his status there is he's a key figure in the Kinahan organisation, or certainly within that. So is he remaining sort of loyal to the Kinahan crew? Or?
Well, I mean, and is there a criminal organisation that continues to exist that Peadar Keating was a part of in West Dublin, that while obviously it had been intimately linked with the Byrne organised crime group, but there's every reason to believe that criminal structure that was kind of separate and sort of independent, if aligned, continues to exist. So exactly, it's all very well. I mean, we do it all the time. That person is linked to the Kinahans, but it's way more complex when you get into this sort of,
for sure,
this reality.
But Kavanagh
will, I don't know that he can ever take his place again at the head of organised crime, having dealt with the police in that way. I really find it hard to believe. But who knows?
Well, look, I'm no doubt we'll be talking about him again.
No doubt we will.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Niall.
Thanks, Nicola.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.